$7 trillion sounds large. It is large. But history suggests that the size of a number is rarely the most important detail. What matters more is when that movement happens, where it flows, and how quietly it occurs. Large financial shifts that dominate headlines are usually the least informative ones. They arrive late, after the structure has already changed. By the time a movement becomes visible, it has often finished doing its most important work. What remains is interpretation, debate, and noise. History shows that the most consequential economic changes do not announce themselves. They do not arrive as shocks. They emerge as adjustments, incremental, technical, easily dismissed. They appear boring at the moment they matter most. This is why so many structural shifts pass unnoticed. Modern audiences are trained to process the world through events. A crash, a rate decision, a war, a headline. This creates what can be called news thinking, a belief that history moves through moments rather than sequences. But systems do not behave this way. Systems evolve slowly, unevenly, and often invisibly. When a system changes direction, it does not do so all at once. It reallocates, it tests, it hedges, it prepares. The difficulty is not that information is hidden. The difficulty is that it does not look important when it appears. Throughout history, large reallocations of capital, trade, or reserves were rarely understood in real time. They were interpreted later, once outcomes made them obvious. At the moment of transition, they were framed as technical decisions, efficiency measures, or temporary responses. This is not accidental. Large systems are designed to avoid panic. They change quietly because stability depends on continuity of belief. If participants were aware of the full implications of every structural shift, the system would destabilize itself prematurely. So the system moves in fragments. Small changes in settlement methods, adjustments in reserve composition, subtle redirection of trade flows, incremental policy coordination, none of these individually signal crisis. Together, they form a pattern. History shows that when capital moves silently and persistently in one direction, it is rarely reacting to short-term events. It is repositioning for a different future environment. Yet these movements rarely dominate media narratives. They lack drama. They lack a clear villain. They do not offer immediate consequences. And because they unfold over years rather than days, they conflict with the tempo of modern attention. There is also a cognitive reason these shifts are missed. The human brain is exceptionally good at detecting threats that are sudden, visible, and personal. It is far less capable of perceiving slow structural change. Gradual shifts feel safe precisely because they are gradual. Normalcy bias reinforces the belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday, especially when daily life appears unchanged. This bias has repeated consequences. In every major economic transition, participants continue to behave as if existing rules will hold until very late in the process. They assume reversibility. They assume temporary deviation. They assume intent aligns with past behavior. History suggests otherwise. When systems begin reallocating resources at scale, they are rarely improvising. They are responding to accumulated constraints, trade imbalances, demographic pressures, political limits, strategic vulnerabilities. None of these resolve suddenly. They compound. What makes these moments difficult to interpret is that nothing appears broken. Markets function. Goods move. Institutions operate. The surface remains intact, but underneath, incentives shift. In previous eras, similar reallocations occurred under different labels: gold movements between empires, silver drains through trade routes, reserve hoarding before monetary resets, industrial capacity relocation prior to political realignment. At the time, these shifts were explained away as pragmatism, as efficiency, as modernization. Only later were they recognized as preparation. This pattern has appeared before. A system grows comfortable with interdependence. One side consumes, another accumulates. Over time, asymmetries deepen. The arrangement feels stable because it benefits both sides, until it doesn't. At a certain point, accumulation becomes strategic rather than economic. Reserves are no longer held for yield or liquidity, but for optionality, for insulation, for leverage. This transition does not require confrontation. It does not require announcement. It requires patience, and patience is difficult to detect from the outside. Most observers look for intent in speeches, policies, or ideology, but systems reveal their priorities through allocation, not language. What is funded, what is stored, what is quietly deprioritized. The question then is not whether a number is large. The question is why the movement happens now, after decades of relative continuity. Why this direction? Why this pace? Why this structure? These are not questions that can be answered by a single headline or quarterly report. They require a longer view, a willingness to step back from events and observe sequences. This is where cycle thinking replaces news thinking. Cycle thinking does not ask what happened today. It asks what phase we are in. It does not focus on outcomes, but on positioning. It does not look for collapse, but for preparation. History shows that systems rarely fail at their weakest moment. They fail when participants are most confident in their stability. when diversification feels unnecessary, when risk feels theoretical. The most dangerous transitions are not the ones marked by chaos, but the ones marked by calm. When adjustments happen without friction, when nothing forces attention, at those moments, the question, has this happened before, becomes more important than any forecast. Because history does not repeat events, it repeats structures. And the structure visible now is not one of sudden breakdown, but of quiet rearrangement. Because history doesn't announce collapse, it prepares it. History becomes useful when it stops being a collection of stories and starts revealing structure. Individual names, dates, and conflicts matter far less than the sequences that connect them. When those sequences repeat across eras, systems, and technologies, they stop being coincidences. This pattern has appeared before. Not once, but repeatedly, under different conditions and different currencies. The details change, the structure does not. The first stage always looks benign. It begins with interdependence. Two sides find mutual advantage in exchange. One specializes in production, the other in consumption. Trade expands, efficiency improves, living standards rise. The arrangement feels stabilizing because both sides benefit in visible ways. This is usually described as globalization, integration, or modernization. History shows that this stage can last for decades, long enough for participants to treat it as permanent. Over time, however, a subtle imbalance emerges. One side accumulates claims, reserves, or productive capacity. The other accumulates obligations, consumption habits, or structural dependencies. Neither appears threatening because the system still functions smoothly. This is the second stage, asymmetric accumulation. At this point, imbalance is no longer theoretical, but it remains politically invisible. Consumption feels like prosperity. Accumulation feels like efficiency. The feedback loop reinforces itself. Credit expands. Trust deepens. Dependency becomes normalized. Historically, this stage is where most observers stop asking structural questions. Growth metrics look healthy. Markets remain liquid. There is no obvious trigger for concern. But beneath the surface, incentives begin to diverge. The accumulating side gradually shifts from maximizing returns to minimizing exposure. Reserves are no longer held solely for transactional purposes. They become strategic buffers, insurance against disruption, tools of optionality. This marks the transition into the third stage, strategic repositioning. This is the most difficult phase to recognize in real time. Strategic repositioning does not announce itself. It hides behind technical language. Portfolio adjustments, risk management, settlement efficiency, supply chain resilience. Each change appears reasonable in isolation. What matters is not any single decision, but their direction and persistence. History shows that when a system begins building alternatives quietly, it is not signaling aggression. It is signaling reduced trust in continuity. It is preparing for scenarios that are not yet visible, but increasingly plausible. In past monetary systems, this took the form of reserve diversification, gold accumulation, alternative clearing mechanisms, bilateral trade agreements that bypassed dominant settlement channels. None of these caused immediate disruption. That was not their purpose. Their purpose was insulation. This stage is dangerous precisely because it looks like stability. Trade continues. Markets remain open. Institutions function. The public sees no reason to question the system's durability, but the architecture is already changing. The final stage comes much later and often appears sudden to those who missed the earlier phases. This is the controlled break. Despite the name, it is rarely chaotic at the system level. It is controlled in the sense that the side that repositioned earlier experiences less shock than the side that relied on continuity. The break may take many forms. Monetary realignment, trade fragmentation, financial repression, capital controls, redefined reserve roles. It is rarely framed as failure. More often, it is described as necessity. What matters is not the specific outcome, but the asymmetry of impact. History shows that those who assumed permanence absorb disproportionate loss. Those who prepared absorb inconvenience. This four-stage sequence has repeated across empires, currencies, and trade regimes. Interdependence, asymmetric accumulation, strategic repositioning, controlled break. Each stage flows logically into the next. None require conspiracy, none require perfect foresight. They emerge from incentives and constraints. The third stage is always the most dangerous, not because collapse is imminent, but because misinterpretation is most likely. Observers confuse calm for stability, continuity for permanence. At this point, analysts argue about narratives rather than structures. They debate intent instead of allocation. They search for confirmation in speeches while ignoring balance sheets. History suggests that when alternatives are built quietly, the decision to use them has already been made in principle. Timing becomes flexible. The path forward becomes optional rather than forced. The question, where are we now, cannot be answered with dates or predictions. History does not move on a calendar. It moves through thresholds. What can be said is this: The most dangerous moment is not when stress is visible. It is when systems still appear normal, but no longer behave as if they trust that normal to continue. This is the moment when preparation outweighs participation. The most dangerous moment is when everything still looks normal. When a system enters the final phase of a long transition, the consequences are rarely immediate. History shows that structural change does not express itself through instant collapse, but through delayed adjustment. The effects arrive unevenly, often long after the original repositioning has taken place. This is why these moments are so frequently misunderstood. Markets tend to react to events, not preparations. Prices move on surprises, not on slow reallocations that have already occurred. By the time consequences become visible, the underlying shift is no longer reversible. What changes is not the direction of the system, but who bears the cost of adjustment. The first implication of this pattern is timing. Economic transitions do not reward those who respond quickly to headlines. They reward those who were already positioned before the headline appeared. This is not because of superior insight, but because the system itself moved earlier, quietly, when attention was elsewhere. History shows that delayed impact is not an accident. It is a feature. Lag allows continuity of function while structural alignment takes place. Trade continues. Contracts are honored. Markets operate. But the distribution of risk changes underneath. This leads to the second implication. Asymmetry. When adjustments finally surface, they do not affect all participants equally. Those most exposed to continuity assumptions absorb the largest shock. Those who reduce dependency earlier experience friction, but not collapse. In past transitions, this asymmetry appeared repeatedly. Creditors versus debtors, accumulators versus consumers, producers versus intermediaries. The distinction was rarely moral or ideological. It was structural. What mattered was not intelligence or foresight, but positioning within the system. The third implication concerns perception. Most people experience economic change as sudden because they encounter it at the point of consequence, not at the point of cause. A currency weakens, liquidity tightens, trade patterns shift. These feel abrupt because the preparatory phase was invisible or ignored. History suggests that by the time adjustment becomes unavoidable, the debate shifts from whether to how. Policy discussions no longer focus on prevention, but on management. Options narrow. Trade-offs become explicit. This is often misread as failure. In reality, it is resolution. The system is not collapsing. It is completing a transition that began much earlier. Another implication lies in wealth movement. In every major structural realignment, wealth does not disappear. It relocates. Assets tied to old assumptions lose relative value. Assets aligned with new structures gain relevance. This process is slow, uneven, and rarely dramatic in real time. History shows that wealth transfers are most visible only after they are complete. When new hierarchies appear normalized, when new centers of stability are treated as inevitable. This is why these moments feel disorienting in retrospect. People assume something unexpected occurred. In reality, something expected unfolded quietly. Importantly, this pattern does not imply catastrophe. Most transitions do not end in collapse. They end in reconfiguration. Systems adapt because they must. What changes is not the existence of the system, but its internal logic. The danger lies not in change itself, but in misreading its nature. When observers frame structural shifts as temporary disruptions, they underestimate duration. When they frame them as unprecedented, they underestimate familiarity. History shows that neither interpretation is useful. What matters is understanding sequence. This video is not a warning. It does not predict dates, outcomes, or winners. It describes a pattern that has appeared before and is recognizable only when viewed through time rather than headlines. Understanding cycles does not provide certainty. It does not eliminate risk. It does not offer immunity. But history suggests it offers something quieter and more durable: orientation. Understanding cycles doesn't make you rich. It prevents you from being wiped out.